Chapter 8, Social Class in the United States. For the most part, Americans, when they are asked about social class, they will divide people into three categories: the rich, the poor, and everyone else in between, who are neither rich nor poor. The fact is that sociologists have no clear-cut, agreed-upon definition of social class. Most sociologists use Weber's components to define social class, defining it as a large group of people who rank close to one another in terms of wealth, power, and prestige. These components determine a person's chances in life, separate them into different lifestyles, and provide them with distinctive ways of looking at the self and the world. Now, wealth consists of property, what we own, and income, the money that we receive. It is important to distinguish between wealth and income because they are not always the same. A person may own much property, yet have little income, or vice versa. But usually wealth and income go together. When you add up all of a person's assets and subtract their debts, you have what sociologists call wealth. So for example, buildings, land, animals, machinery, cars, stocks and bonds, businesses, furniture, jewelry, and bank accounts. So wealth is a person's net worth. Income, on the other hand, is the flow of money which can come from many sources: wages or business, rent, interest, royalties, alimony, allowance, gambling winnings. So some people can have, this is the money that we receive. So some people can have much wealth but little income. So for example, a farmer owns his property but may have a slow season and then have little income. Others might have much income but little wealth. And an example here would be an executive with $250,000 salary but has a lot of heavy debt and is in a lot of debt. So let's look at the distribution of wealth. Ownership of property, real estate, stocks, bonds, etc., is not distributed evenly. So for example, 10% of the U.S. population owns 77% of the nation's wealth. And the wealthiest 1% of Americans own a third of all assets in the U.S. So let's take a look at this. Here's a chart that describes the distribution of wealth of Americans. If you remember, in the last chapter we saw a similar chart that described the distribution around the world, but here we have it in the United States. So on the left side of the table, the wealthiest 1% of Americans own 35% of the nation's wealth. And on the right side, you see the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 77% of the nation's wealth. So it's indicating a small number of people who have ownership of a large amount of the wealth. Income is also unevenly distributed. So here's a table that illustrates that. Now, the average per capita income in the U.S. is $42,000 per year. And this figure includes every American and their children. The average family income in the U.S. is about $60,000. This includes dual income earners. So while U.S. families have incomes that, if measured in feet, would exceed the height of Mount Everest, and that's basically what this table shows, with a little more detailed income figures. So in this table, it illustrates that the average U.S. individual income is actually $48,000 or 12 feet. So if you had children's building blocks, is what this table shows, and if you stack them up, how high they would go. So that would equate to about 12 feet. And if you have the average U.S. family income, and here the more accurate figure is the 67,000, or stack those blocks up to 17 feet. But there are some U.S. families that have incomes that exceed the height of Mount Everest, over 29,000 feet high. Furthermore, if we were to divide the U.S. population into 5 equal groups and rank them from lowest to highest based on income, that would be illustrated here in this table. So the more things change, the more they stay the same if we divide those nations' income. And you see the top fifth is represented by that purple bar. Go back to 1935. We saw a dip in those bars. They dipped down to almost about 40% by 1960, 1970, and then they started to rise up again. So we're seeing again an adjustment. So the top 20% of U.S. residents receive half of all the income in the U.S., while the bottom 20%, that's what's illustrated, and that bottom fifth of Americans receive only about 3.3% of the nation's income. So this is how we're taking a closer look in this table. Since 1970, the richest 20% of U.S. families have grown richer. That's why we see that increase in that purple bar, after a decrease from 1935 to 1970. And the poorest 20% are receiving less of the nation's income today than they did decades ago. Now, the second and third fifths receive approximately the same proportion as they did in 1935, but the fours also dipped. And a little hard to see if you can take a look at the bar and how high it reaches in each of the decades. Now, the lifestyle differences of those who had that type of wealth is so dramatic. They experience life in quite a different way than the rest of us, and as compared to many poor families who need to make a choice between buying food or paying a bill, buying medication or food for the elderly. So while the rich may choose between where to go on vacation next, where to sail their yacht or fly the jet. So again, very distinct, very different lifestyles. Here we're going to talk about power, the second component of social class. We have what's called and referred to as the democratic facade. And we learn at a very early age that we participate in our nation's big decisions based on who we vote into office indirectly. Yet we actually don't give the okay on whether or not to go to war, raise taxes, or etc. According to sociologists Daniel Hellinger and Dennis Judd, there is this democratic facade that conceals the real source of power in the United States. So where is the source of power? This is the power elite that sociologist C. Wright Mills spoke about. He said that power, the ability to exercise one's will over another, is concentrated in the hands of a few. His term, the power elite, refers to those who are the big decision makers in the United States society. This group shares the same ideologies and values, belong to the same social clubs and groups, and reinforces each other's worldview. Now, William Domhoff, as a more recent current sociologist, argues that no major decision in the United States government is made without the elite's approval. He analyzed how they work behind the scenes with elected officials. Although somewhat controversial, it follows that wealth brings power, and those with this wealth and power have influence. Now the third component, prestige. Prestige is the respect or regard that people give to various occupations and accomplishments. Occupations, the occupations that almost all of us choose is how we choose to make a living. So for many of us, we identify ourselves. We say, I am a sociologist, I am a teacher, I am a lawyer, I am a doctor. We internalize that occupation. It becomes who we are. And occupations are the primary source of prestige. Although some people gain prestige from inventions or being, heroic feats or performing good deeds for others. Some jobs or occupations are given more prestige than others. So there was, the General Social Survey is a survey that's administered to the general public. And when these people were asked to rank occupations on a scale from 1 to 100, the rankings of those occupations are listed from lowest to highest. The lower the number, the lower the prestige ranking. The higher the ranking, the higher the prestige. So occupations typically with the highest prestige, they pay more, number one. Number two, they require more education. Number three, it entails more abstract thought. And four, it offers greater autonomy. There's more independence or self-direction in these sorts of occupations. Less prestige is given to jobs with the opposite of those characteristics. Lower pay, you don't need a lot of education, there's not a lot of abstract thought required, and there's a lot more people who are overseen by, a higher authority in those occupations. White-collar jobs typically fill those occupations at the top of the list, and blue-collar jobs are typically at the bottom of the list. Now, these occupational rankings have been consistent across countries and across time. And here is that table that's put together. So if you look at these, and I'm going to show you, there's multiple slides that, because this is a very long table. Occupations on the left. It's how the United States would rank it. So that 86 for a physician is 86 out of 100 score. And then there's average for 60 countries. And you can see how the U.S. ranks against the rest of the world in terms of these types of occupations. So these are the top prestige occupations. And then we start to go down the list. So it's sorted according to the U.S. I think sociologist is, yeah, there it is. Sociologist. Let's see if I could point that out. I'll highlight it. There's a sociologist. Okay. So if we were in class, I would have an actual activity that allows you to select the occupations and sort them in according to what you think is most important. And you'd be surprised, many of these occupations, like, a street sweeper, for example, we need people to fulfill that occupation in our communities. If we didn't have someone that collected our garbage and, swept the streets, that garbage and trash would pile up. And so I think we're seeing now, under this circumstances of the quarantine, occupations that are really necessary for our comfortable daily living. And when those occupations, when people aren't able to work in those jobs, there's higher unemployment. And when people can't get those services, many people, feel uncomfortable. Okay, one more point to be made about prestige before I discuss this point of status and consistency. And this was on the last slide, so after, if you want to go back and take a look at that. Displaying prestige. For prestige to be valuable, people must acknowledge it. And traditionally, the elite have made rules to emphasize their higher status. So, for example, someone in the military, we salute, people that are in the military. We, people in England, bow to the king or queen, and just in general, you would bow to a king or queen out of respect. A judge, in a court, people stand as the judge walks in the room. So we see these status symbols that sort of vary according to the social class, but they're ways of displaying that prestige, those status symbols. A police officer that wears a badge, a doctor that wears, the white lab coat. And in general, in the U.S., these can include things like, designer clothes or expensive cars and jewelry. And big fancy homes and Ivy League schools. They provide, prestige and status to the person. Expensive handbags. If you see somebody carrying a really expensive handbag or wearing expensive jewelry, that's a status symbol, and it really people look to those symbols to kind of represent that person's status and prestige. Now, the status and consistency is the term that's used to describe the situation of people who have a mixture of high and low rankings in those three components we just talked about, the three components of social class: wealth, power, and prestige. Now, most people are status consistent. They rank at the same level in all three of the components. They kind of go together. People who are status inconsistent want others to act toward them on the basis of their highest status, but others tend to judge based on the lowest. And according to Gerhard Lenski, people are usually trying to maximize their status. People that suffering the frustrations of status inconsistency are more likely to be radical and approve political action aimed against higher status groups, seeing people in those high status positions. So status inconsistency is very common. If you think about it, here's a good example. For someone who wins the lottery, somebody who may be in a lower class who buys a lottery ticket, all of a sudden wins. So this wealth is far greater than their occupational status or their education prior to those winnings coming in. And so all of a sudden they're, jetted into this high status position. That's kind of a good way to think about, how that status inconsistency would make sense. Okay, next we're going to look at our sociological models of social class. And although both Karl Marx and Max Weber proposed models of social class, both of these models have been modified to be more representative of the class structure as it exists now. So we look at how we've updated Marx. Sociologist Eric Wright realized that not everybody falls into Marx's two broad classes of capitalists and workers, or bourgeoisie and proletariat. Capitalists and workers, the two classes based on a person's relationship to the means of production. So for example, although executives, managers, and supervisors would fall into Marx's category of workers, they act more like capitalists. So Wright resolved this problem by regarding some people as simultaneously members of more than one class, which he called contradictory class locations. Wright, because of the contradictory class locations, modified Marx's model to include four classes. So the first, or A, is capitalists, the owners of large enterprises or businesses. B, the petty bourgeoisie. These are the owners of small business. C, the managers. These are employees who have authority over others. And then D, the workers. So this model provides a more, a finer division, a finer distinction of these categories. Now, using the model originally developed by Max Weber, sociologists Dennis Gilbert and Joseph Call created a model to describe class structure in the U.S. and other capitalist countries. This includes wealth, power, and prestige, and education. And this is a 6-class model. So that's the model we're going to really focus on and use for our discussion of social class. Here's Marx's model of the social classes: the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production; the workers, the proletariat, those who work for the capitalists and are exploited; and then there's inconsequential others, beggars, anyone else who would fall, not be in those other two categories and fall into the last category. And here's Wright's modification: the capitalists, the petty bourgeoisie, the managers, and then the workers. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this table as I discuss the social class model by Gilbert and Call. So capitalist class consists of about 1%, you'll see on the right-hand column the percents I'm going to go over, of the population. So this is the top 1%. And it's made up of investors, heirs, and a few executives. They're worth more than the entire bottom 90%. And they can be divided into old money and new money. The old money capitalists, or as they're referred to as blue bloods, have a great deal of power and extensive political connections. The new money, or the nouveau riche, are at the lower end of the capitalist class, but they can move into the old money class by, attending the right schools and marrying into old money. The next category is the upper middle class, and they consist of 15% of the population. This class is composed of professionals and upper managers, almost all who have attended college or universities and frequently have postgraduate degrees. This class is the most shaped by education. So the upper middle class is the class most shaped by education. The lower middle class, or 34% of the population, is composed of lower managers, craftspeople, foremen, and they can afford a mainstream lifestyle, but they struggle to maintain it. So they have at least a high school education, maybe some certifications. Working class, or 30% of the population, is composed of factory workers, low-paid white-collar workers. Most have a high school education. Their jobs are less secure. And one of the greatest fears of this social class is being laid off. The working poor, 15% of the population. This class is composed of relatively unskilled blue-collar and white-collar workers and those with temporary or seasonal jobs. If they graduated high school, they may not have done so well. But even though they may work full-time, millions of the working poor depend on food stamps and local food pantries to survive on their low incomes. And many of these jobs pay minimum wage, which is not enough to get by on. The national minimum wage is $7.25, and there is a table that you can check out to see the various minimum wages for the various states. In New Jersey, the last I checked, and you could probably check even closer, in 2018 was $8.60, and it was due to continue to rise in increments until it's raised to about $15 an hour. Well, although we're quite not there yet. There was a classic study by Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickel and Dimed on not getting by in America. And she did a participant observation where she really tried to make it on minimum wage. And that was the $7.25 figure that she was working for. And she did this investigation investigating the 1996 Welfare Reform Act on the working poor, and she really had a difficult time. She traveled to 3 different states. So if you have the time and you'd like to take a look at that, her research, it's a really good book, and I think some articles have come out of her. So you would search for Barbara Ehrenreich. Underclass, the last class here we're going to talk about on this table. 5% of the population. This is the underclass, the persistently poor. And this population is concentrated in the inner cities, and they have little connection with the job market. If they work, they do menial, low-paying, temporary work. So this class relies on welfare and food stamps and the food pantries as their main support. Life is the toughest in this class. Now, the homeless are so far down the class structure that their position must be considered even lower than the underclass. They're the victims or the fallout of industrialization, especially post-industrial developments, that really have led to the decline in the demand for unskilled labor. So now let's talk about some of the ways social class affects our lives. So we're going to talk about our physical health, mental health, our family life, education, religion, politics, and even crime in the criminal justice system. Our physical health. The lower a person's social class, the more likely that person is to die at an earlier age than people in higher classes. And this is true for all ages. Social class shapes our lifestyles, which affects our health. Also, since medical care is expensive, the higher classes receive better medical care despite government aid to the poor. Life is also better for those in higher social classes. They have fewer problems and more resources to deal with the ones that they do have compared to the poor or those in the lower classes. And here you see the bar graph showing the correlation between lower income and greater likelihood of physical difficulties. So those with less than $35,000 a year have difficulty with everyday physical activities. It's the highest percent, almost 25. Mental health is worse for the lower classes because of the stresses associated with their class position. Those in the higher classes are better able to afford vacations, and psychiatrists and counselors. Their class position gives them greater control over their lives, which is a key to good mental health. And in this table, the question was asked, I always or almost always feel sad, hopeless, and or worthless. And those with less than $35,000 have the highest percentages on those three categories. If we think of family life, social class position affects our choice of our spouses, our chances of getting divorced, and how we raise our children. If you think about a choice of a husband or wife, children of the capitalist class are under great pressure to select the appropriate mate to assume that continuity of the family name and the family line. Parents in this social class play a large role in mate selection. Marriages are more likely to fail in the lower social classes given the challenges of inadequate income. The children of the poor are more likely to live in single-parent households, particularly female single-parent households. Child rearing varies by social class, with each class raising its children according to the attitudes and behaviors that fit the kinds of occupations they will eventually hold. So, for example, lower class families teach children to defer to authority, as is required in their jobs. The middle class families encourage freedom and creativity and self-expression, as is found in their jobs. When it comes to education, education levels increase as one moves up the social ladder. The difference is not in just the amount of education, but also the type of education. Upper class capitalists will favor private schools over public. They can hire tutors as young as 4 years. They can hire tutors for their children as young as 4 years old to prep for kindergarten. Parental involvement is also more likely. That along with additional resources, they can put the privileged in an advantaged position. A sociologist that I was under the education of at Temple University, Annette Leroux. She discussed this in her work called Unequal Childhoods. So Annette Leroux, a sociologist who was also at one point president of the American Sociological Association, wrote a book called Unequal Childhoods, and how these different social classes, put children at different advantages depending on their education, called concentrated cultivation. Next, religion. All aspects of religious orientation follow class lines. Social classes tend to cluster around different denominations. Episcopalians, for example, are more likely to be middle and upper class. Baptists from lower classes. Lower classes prefer more expressive worship services, while higher classes prefer more restrained services. When it comes to politics, political views and involvement are also influenced by social class. The rich and the poor take different political paths, with people in the lower social classes more likely to vote Democratic, while those in higher classes vote Republican. The parties are seen as promoting different class interests. People in the working class are more likely to be liberal or on economic issues, more government spending, for example, and more conservative on social issues like opposing abortion and the Equal Rights Amendment. Political participation is also not equal. Upper classes are more likely to vote and get involved in politics than those in the lower classes. And with regards to the criminal justice system and crime, white-collar crimes of the more privileged classes are more likely to be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system, as we saw in Chapter 6, while the street crimes of the lower classes are dealt with by the police and the courts. Members of the lower classes are more likely to be arrested and more likely to be on probation or parole or in jail, and more crimes are likely to occur in lower class neighborhoods, like robberies and burglaries and murder. Now, unlike the other systems of stratification, class is the most fluid, offering opportunities and providing social mobility, both vertically and horizontally along the social class ladder. The three basic types of social mobility we're going to talk about here are intergenerational, structural, and exchange. Intergenerational mobility is the change that family members make in their social class from one generation to the next. That is your position relative to your parents. So if you become a teacher and your parents may have been laborers, that is intergenerational mobility. Your job as a teacher has higher occupational prestige than their jobs as laborers. So as a result of individual effort, your achieved status, a person can rise from one level to another. In the event of individual failure, the opposite can be true. And usually this intergenerational mobility only occurs by one or two movements, usually up or down. So we can, in other words, move up in social mobility or downward in social mobility in terms of intragenerational mobility, which is not listed on this slide. And that's the mobility within our own generation. So say we start out as a teacher's aide and move up to a full-time teacher, maybe up to a principal even, or even to the superintendent of schools. That's called intragenerational. A little different than inter. I-N-T-E-R is that mobility in relation to your parents. I-N-T-R-A is generational mobility within your own lifetime. Now, structural mobility. Structural mobility involves social changes that affect large numbers of people. So changes in society result in people being able to move up or down the class ladder. As sociologists, we look at changes in a society, its structure, that result in either plenty of opportunities or a scarce number of opportunities. So for example, the technological advances. When computers were invented, many opportunities opened up for people to switch from blue-collar work to white-collar work. While individual effort should also be taken into account, the major reason for the change in position is structural, because it opened up all those new opportunities. Now, exchange mobility is the third type of social mobility, and this is when people move up and down the social class ladder where the system balances itself and remains the same. The proportions remain the same. So, for example, millions of people move up in social class and take new technology jobs. Millions take skilled labor positions in a lower strata, therefore balancing or creating an exchange among the social classes. Now, women have generally been ignored in studies of occupational mobility. Studies among men, you see half of sons have moved past their fathers, a third have stayed at the same level, and a sixth have fallen down the ladder, according to Blau and Duncan in a study. But as structural changes in the U.S. economy have created opportunities for women to move up the social ladder, studies of their mobility patterns are starting to appear. And one study finds that women who did move up were encouraged by their families by parents to postpone marriage and get an education. So we've seen that pattern sort of happen among women in society. We recognize that moving down the social class ladder can be painful, but moving up comes at a cost too. For example, a study of British women who achieved middle class status felt caught between two worlds, the one they were brought up in and the current status. And an American study found that among working class families where the adult children achieved upward mobility, the relationships between the parents and the children were strained because the parents made sacrifices for their child and they don't feel fully appreciated. So that's the pain sometimes experienced with social mobility. Okay, so next topic we're going to talk about is poverty. The working poor and underclass together form about 1/5 of the U.S. population. This equates to approximately 60 million people. So who are they? We want to know, who are those who live in poverty. We want to look at what the poverty line is, discuss children and poverty and why people may be poor. And the dynamics of poverty versus the culture of poverty. So to measure the degree of poverty a family faces, the government came up with a standard based on family size and income to find out who are the poor. So this is what the poverty line is referred to as. The poverty line is the model that is based on the factor of 3 times what the average family of a specific size would spend on food. Families making less than the calculated amount would be considered to be below the poverty line and are entitled to benefits specifically available to the poor. Now these figures are always calculated, yearly, and so they get adjusted, and there's a table that is set up depending on, the size of the family, from a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, or any other variation. So there is a table that is used to kind of verify who would fall under this, the poverty line. There's 2 things. First, this measure is inadequate because it inflates the amount of money that is spent on food. It is also the same across the country. So even though the cost of living is higher in some states than others, it's a standard rate that's used across the country. And secondly, any modification of this measure instantly adds or subtracts millions of people and can have serious consequences on those families and individuals. So who are the poor? Certain social groups are disproportionately represented among the poor population. So first, let's look at geography. The poor tend to be clustered in the South, a pattern that really has existed for almost 100 years. The poverty rate for the rural poor is higher than the national average. While they show the same racial and ethnic characteristics as the nation as a whole, they are less likely to be on welfare or to be single parents, are less skilled and educated, and find that only lower paying jobs are available to them. When it comes to race and ethnicity, race is a major factor in who's poor. Racial minorities are much more likely to be poor. So some statistics are 10% of whites, 20% of Latinos, and 24% of African Americans live in poverty. The chances of being poor decreases as the amount of education increases. So education plays a big part. The higher your education, the less likely you are to be poor. The feminization of poverty is, that was where the gender of the person who heads a family is another major predictor. So of whether or not a family is poor. So being female, most poor families are headed by women, and this phenomenon is called the feminization of poverty. And this typically results from divorce, births to unwed mothers, and the lower wages that are typically paid to women. Now, the elderly are less likely than the general population to be poor, although the percent of poor people over age 65 is the same as their overall percentage. However, elderly Hispanics and African Americans are almost 3 times more likely to be poor than elderly white Americans. Government policy, Social Security, subsidized housing, food stamps, and medical care have helped to keep the elderly numbers down. Also, many elderly may have accumulated wealth to keep them out of poverty. So here we have a pie chart illustrating the overview of poverty in the United States. This is of all the U.S. poor, what percentages are from these particular groups. And this is racial ethnic groups. So 44% are white Americans, Latinos are 28%, African Americans 22%, 2% Native American, and 4% Asian American. This is from the Statistical Abstract of the United States. If you look at family structure and poverty, depending on who heads the family, we see here supporting the fact that if a woman is the head of the household, they have a higher percent of being in poverty. And here we have poverty, age, and racial ethnic group. The bar graph demonstrates the greater likelihood of some racial ethnic groups, youth and or elderly, to be in poverty than others. So each bar represents the racial group, and then you have to the left the elderly, age 65 and older, and children under age 18. Highest being among African Americans and Latinos, of children under the age of 18. But here the poverty line is $24,230 for a family of 4. That's that poverty line figure we discussed earlier. Children are more likely to live in poverty than than our older adults or even the elderly. This holds true regardless of race, but poverty is much greater among minority children. One major reason is the large number of births to women who are not married, about 1.7 million. So children are more likely to be poor, especially when they're Latino or African American, as we saw on that table, and especially when compared with the elderly. In the 1960s, it was suggested that the poor get trapped in a culture of poverty as a result of having values and behaviors that make them different from other U.S. residents. National statistics indicate that most poverty, though, is really short-lived, lasting only 1 year or less. Only 12% of the poor live in poverty for 5 or more years. So since the number of people who live in poverty remains fairly constant, this means that as many people move into poverty as move out of it. Many people typically live on the edge of poverty. It takes a poverty trigger to really push them over that edge. So, for example, a dramatic life change like divorce, an accident, an illness, or the loss of a job. These are poverty triggers that would push someone into moving below the poverty line. So we look at this pie chart of how long poverty lasts. For 60%, it's 1 year or less. So people are typically only under poverty for a short amount of time. So why are people poor? In really trying to explain poverty, the choice is between focusing on individual explanations or on social structural explanations. Now, sociologists, first of all, look to social factors or things in the social structure. Inequalities in education, for example, access to learning, job skills, racial, ethnic, age, and gender discrimination, and any large-scale economic changes that help explain these patterns of poverty in society. And the other explanation is individualistic, focusing on the characteristics of individuals that are assumed to contribute to their poverty. And since these explanations typically blame the victim, we tend not to focus on these. But these are things like, dropping out of school, dropping out of high school, and teen pregnancy and childbearing. And so those would be individualistic explanations. But we tend not to focus on those. We focus on, the more large-scale social factors. And lastly, the poverty triggers. These poverty triggers also explain why people are poor. Unexpected events in life that really would push someone, push people into poverty.